Lemkin's work remains profoundly relevant to today. The crime of genocide has been repeated time and time again, and the denial of genocide and the willingness of people and governments to look the other way is all too common. And I'm reminded of Lemkin's words that a crime unpunished is a crime repeated, and indeed that is as relevant today as when he said those words. So today's event will reflect how Lemkin's ideas have shaped international law, how his work was born from the shock of the Armenian genocide, and how that went on to guide experts investigating and prosecuting perpetrators of the Holocaust, the Cambodian genocide, the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis, and the Srebrenica genocide in Bosnia. And I think the Genocide Convention, which he helped create, continues to be the yardstick by which all subsequent atrocities have been measured. But that convention, indeed the whole system of international law, has never appeared more fragile than it currently is, and has never felt more under threat than since it was introduced. And I think so, whether it's as politicians, as academics, the legal profession or civil society, we all have a responsibility to ensure that that system of international law, including the Genocide Convention, survives for the next 80 years and much further beyond that. And I think an important part of ensuring that the Genocide Convention's future is to remember its past and to remember why it came into being and what the world witnessed before it said never again. And that's why we meet today, to honour and remember the man who contributed so much to both how the world views the crime of genocide and the formation of international criminal law. And I'm delighted that we've been joined by such a distinguished panel of experts and guests who will give their insights both into his life and into his legacy. But we will begin with a short film on the life and work of Raphael Lemkin. So the way that today is going to run, we have three panels, and the first panel is going to talk about the origins and impunity. The second panel will be witnessing genocide. The third panel will be living testimony and lessons learned. And thereafter, if we have any time left, we'll have a question and answer, and we'll open it to the floor. Before I introduce the first panel, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. I feel slightly ridiculous in introducing Professor Philippe Sands as if he needs an introduction from me. Professor of Law at the University College London and visiting Professor of Law at Harvard, a practising barrister who is known throughout not just the UK and Europe but across the world as one of the great champions of international law. Appears regularly before the ICJ and other international courts and tribunals, and we are absolutely delighted to have him with us today. I'm particularly delighted because I finally got him to sign. I think I had the only unsigned copy in London. I have now rectified that. It's a huge, huge privilege for me to introduce as our keynote speaker, Professor Philippe Sands.
Very much, Brendan. Very generous introduction. So I'm very privileged to be here, and I want to express my thanks to both All-Party Parliamentary Groups on Armenia and on genocide for carrying the flag at a very difficult time in the world. I think we're not under any illusions about the challenges we face, and I think it's worth going back to the period of Lauterpacht and, of course, his counterpart, Lemkin, and of course his counterpart Lauterpacht, to explain a little bit about the context in which they worked and they functioned. I suppose Lemkin, in a sense, has been a part of my life ever since I studied international law, but I'd never really focused on him. I only started to focus on him after 2010, when I was invited by an obscure university that I had never heard of before, the University of Lviv. Everyone knows where it is today, for all of the most unfortunate of reasons. It's in the Ukraine. would I come and give a lecture on the cases that I'd done on crimes against humanity and genocide before various international courts. So I toddled off there. I'd prepared over the summer of 2010, and I was astonished to discover that the man who put the concept of genocide into international law, Raphael Lemkin, and the man who put the concept of crimes against humanity into international law, Raphael Lemkin, had both studied at the same law school, the University of Lviv. And the folks who had invited me had no idea. And so I sort of arrived in this extraordinary city. Has anyone here been to Lviv? It is the most amazing city, and one that I've been to time and time again. Most recently in June of this year, when the mayor of Lviv invited me to come and to open the street named in honor of Raphael Lemkin on the occasion of his 125th year. And there was a huge celebration at a most difficult time in Ukraine right now. But anyway, back in 2010, I arrived in Lviv bearing the surprising news that the origins of these two concepts may be traced to this very city and indeed to this very law school, where both were students. Let me focus on Lemkin, who was, I think, by any standard, a totally amazing character and human being. Of course, I never met him. He died in 1959. I came into the world in 1960, so I missed him by about a year. But I feel like I know him because I've been so immersed in his life for the last 15 years, writing my book, East-West Street, and then all of the consequences of East-West Street, as well as the cases that I'm still involved in, regrettably. We will have the hearings starting in January in the case of the Gambia against Myanmar on the allegations of genocide in violation of the 1948 Convention in relation to the Rohingya community. And that will be a very important case at the International Court of Justice because it will allow them to revisit for the first time in 10 years since the case of Croatia versus Serbia, which I also argued and failed to persuade the International Court of Justice that the events at Vukovar amounted to a genocide. It'll be the first time the court comes back to address these issues against the context of what is going on in the world today. So the trip to Lviv caused me to immerse myself in the life of Raphael Lemkin. And as you know, those of you who've read the book, for me, matters of substance are very connected to personal issues. It's impossible to separate the individual from the work that he did. And I've been really blessed to have spent some time with people who actually knew Raphael Lemkin. His nephew Saul, who sadly is no longer with us, who I tracked down, he's in his very late 80s, this was more than a decade ago, living in Montreal, who spoke with extraordinary warmth about what his uncle was like as a human being, why he did what he did. You've got the basics in the film. I don't need to revisit the timeline of the work that he did. But essentially describing a man who, even before the horrors of the 1930s and 1940s, was already very strongly connected to a central theme in his life. How do you harness the power of international law to protect human beings? How do you do that? People forget that until 1945, as a matter of classical international law, the state was free to do whatever it wanted to its citizens. If the government of the United Kingdom, pre-1945, want to divide this room in half and say everyone on that side of the room is going to be executed tomorrow, there may have been limitations under domestic English law, or the law of the United Kingdom. There would have been no limitations under international law. What you heard in the film was the correct position. The state was free to treat its citizens as their own children. If it wanted to exterminate them, it was free to do it as a matter of international law. So the idea that Lemkin came up with originally in the 1930s, and he was not alone. The thing that is so complex about Lemkin, and I say this with massive love and with massive warmth, is that he was something of a flawed character. He did make up what my dad, who's an East End boy, would call porky pies, little lies about things that had happened. Most famously, his account, given many times, of attending the Congress of the League of Nations in Madrid in 1933, when he raised his arguments at a meeting like this about the law that he at that time called barbarism and vandalism. Later it became genocide, and said that the two Germans in his room were so horrified by what he said that they walked out of the room in disgust. The problem with the story is that Lemkin wasn't allowed to go to Madrid. The Polish government did not put him on his delegation. He was not in Madrid. He just made up the story. And of course, once you hear one story like that, you begin to treat with a degree of skepticism other stories that you hear. And it's very plain that he made up a whole load of accounts. But the essence is true. The essence of what he did is that he is the person who, in 1944, coined the word genocide. I found in an archive at Columbia University the actual piece of paper in which he writes out the word genocide and other forms of word. There's no doubting it is his idea, it is his word, and that he was absolutely single-minded about pushing the idea. His nephew Saul did not really have an intellectual engagement with him. The intellectual engagement came from a remarkable woman who is still with us, called Nancy Steinson, now in her early 90s, who I managed to track down and who was Raphael Lemkin's research assistant in 1959. And the story I tell in the chapter that begins in East West Street is totally a true story. She's a first-year student at Barnard College, part of Columbia University in New York. She goes for a walk in Riverside Park with her friend who is from India. They stop to have a picnic, and whilst they're having a picnic, this man approaches them. She describes him as disheveled, speaking in a very strong accent. He comes to them, stands before them, and says, "I'm able to say I love you in 20 languages." And I love that story because it indicates the sense of the deep humanity of the man who has just encountered a young couple who actually were not lovers, but seemed to be having a nice time together in the park. Nancy and Raphael came to know each other, and she became his research assistant. She was the one who worked on the book that became a memoir that was only published after East West Street came out. I had drafts of it made available to me. And she described to me the evolution of his ideas, his working methods, his generosity of spirit. And I think in these times, both Lemkin and Lauterpacht give me tremendous inspiration, because we're obviously living in very difficult times right now. And there are people in this room who've been through the most terrible of times, when, like my mum, who went through the most terrible of times, you find hope where you can get it. And Lemkin and Lauterpacht lived through truly terrible times. And they could have given up. They could have said, this is awful. Why bother with ideas? Why bother with writing articles or books? Why bother about ideas about the rule of law domestically or international law? They could have gone into a corner, curled up and wept. But they didn't. Lemkin had ideas of how to make the world a better place, how to make human beings safer from the excesses of the tyranny of states and those who hold power. And he came up with his idea, and he pushed it first in the context of the Nuremberg trial. Nancy Steinson has given a very detailed account of how that all worked out. And when the Nuremberg trial failed in its judgment, I mean, this is forgotten, but it's literally unbelievable, to mention the word genocide. The word genocide does not appear in the Nuremberg judgment. And the reason that it doesn't appear in the Nuremberg judgment is that the United States was completely opposed to the use of the word genocide, because they were worried that it would be used against them in relation to treatment of African Americans and American Indian indigenous communities who had been massacred. The British also, frankly, were not in favour of the term. They wanted it to be used against them in relation to colonial legacy. But Hartley Shawcross, in the closing arguments, did mention the word and asked that the defendants who were indicted for the war crime of genocide be convicted of that crime, which the court did not do. The court gives its judgment in September, October 1946, no mention of genocide. Lemkin describes it as the worst day of my life. Even worse than the day I learned of the deaths of my beloved parents and my entire family, with the exception of my brother and his son. And he will then spend the next 2 years persuading the United Nations to adopt a convention on the prevention and punishment of genocide. And that convention is what was mentioned. And Lemkin is sort of testament to the power of ideas, that ideas really do matter. And the power of those ideas was brought home to me in November 2019, when I was at an academic conference at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I shared the panel with someone who's a real hero for me, again, sadly no longer with us, a man called Thomas Bergenthal. Thomas Bergenthal wrote an extraordinary book called A Lucky Child. I first came across Tom Bergenthal when he was an academic in the United States, but he went on to become the US judge at the International Court of Justice, so a very elevated, distinguished jurist. That was later in life. If you go back to the 1940s, Tom Bergenthal was held at Auschwitz, and he was in the care of a medical doctor called Joseph Mengele. He was one of Mengele's children. And at this panel in 2019, in November, it was just before I was going off to argue with the team I was privileged to be a part of, the case alleging genocide against the Rohingya by Myanmar. I was going to argue against Aung San Suu Kyi. And it was what's called the provisional measures phase, the injunction phase. And Tom said to me, can you imagine, Philippe, if in 1943 and 1944, when I was in Auschwitz, if there had been a treaty on the prevention and punishment of genocide, if there had been an international court, if there had been a country like the Gambia, far away from us, who could go to that court, hold up the piece of paper and say, you cannot treat people in that way, it would have given us hope. And as he said, hope is not nothing. Hope is not anything to be sniffed at. And what Lemkin has done with the invention of his work, which is not without its problems and difficulties. As you know from my writings, I have a concern that the concept of genocide, by setting in stone matters of group identity, may have sometimes contributed to the very things it was intended to prevent. This is the unintended consequence of Lemkin's magic. But Lemkin gave us hope for a different kind of a future. And in the context of the case brought against Myanmar by the Gambia, I will not soon forget the day after the International Court of Justice, in a unanimous decision under the convention, ordered Myanmar to cease its acts which were in violation of the Genocide Convention. We were sent photographs from this bazaar in Bangladesh, where hundreds of thousands of Rohingya were gathered, and they held up placards which simply said, thank you, the Gambian. And I don't ever forget that image, because that image is really what motivated Raphael Lemkin. The invention of his word has not stopped the horrors, but it has given us hope. And a piece of paper which says you can't treat people in this way is not nothing. And it is a means of holding people accountable. And that's particularly important today. Some of you may have heard the interview I did for the Ezra Klein podcast for the New York Times. It was very delicate, because we have a rule at the English bar that when you're involved in cases that are before courts, you don't talk about them publicly. in advance of it. And because I knew the Rohingya case was coming up to the ICJ in January 2026, and I knew, as I've been told by various judges, that they listen to these kinds of podcasts, you've got to be really careful what you say. But attentive listeners will have understood what it was that I was saying. And one of the things I expressed the hope for is that as we go forward, we can return towards Lemkin's conception of genocide, which sets the bar a lot lower than it has been set by the combined actions of states in adopting the Genocide Convention and judges in interpreting and applying the Genocide Convention in a way that makes it very hard to prove genocide. And I said on the Ezra Fine show that if Raphael Lemkin was with us today, he would describe what happened in southern Israel on the 7th of October as a genocide, and he would describe what has happened and is continuing to happen in Gaza today as a genocide, just as he described what happened in Armenia and so many other places as a genocide. For Lemkin, genocide was not a numbers game. For Lemkin, genocide was not about proving this special type of intention. Genocide was, in his view, regrettably a rather regular feature of life. It happened in many parts of the world, many, many times. And I think one of the things that I'm working towards, in the spirit of Lemkin, is bringing the definition and the application of the convention back to what he originally wanted. I conclude, I mentioned it to Brendan, because people seem unaware of it, that one of the reasons there's so much focus on genocide today, as opposed to other crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity. And contrary to many people, I don't believe that there is a hierarchy of horrors. You kill 50,000 people, whether it's called a war crime or a crime against humanity or a genocide, I don't care. It is wrong, it should not happen, and there should be accountability. And all this argument about what label to put on things is, for me, very unhelpful and very distracting about the real horrors that need to be stopped. But finally now, nearly 80 years after the Genocide Convention was adopted, the UN is finally negotiating a convention on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity. And I'm struck that in the United Kingdom, absolutely no one seems to be aware of that fact. And I really urge both these wonderful all-party parliamentary groups who do such fantastic work to think about turning your attention also to supporting that initiative, to raising the profile of it, and even to thinking about changing the name of your all-party parliamentary group to an all-party parliamentary group on genocide and crimes against humanity. Because the problem with putting a focus just on genocide is it sends out a signal that the other crimes are somehow less important. They're not less important. The example that I always give: can you say that the killing of 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men in Srebrenica in the early 1990s is somehow worse than the killing of 3 million people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, because that's only a war crime or a crime against humanity? Obviously not. And I think we all need to reflect on what is the best way to take forward the extraordinary ideas and work of Raphael Lemkin. It's a privilege to speak on his 125th birthday and to be with you today. And thank you all for the incredible work that you do to keep the flag flying and remind us why these things are so incredibly important. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Philip, so much for that. So now we're getting into the meat of our proceedings this afternoon, if you like. And the first panel is going to look at origins and impunity. And I'm delighted that Dr. Meryem has come to join us from the history faculty at the University of Oxford. Her research explores the silence and the harms, the afterlife of genocide in the 20th century Turkey and beyond. She also serves as the college chaplain at St Hilda's College in Oxford as well, and so I'm delighted that you're here. And online, joining us from the Worcester State University in Massachusetts, so, well, hopefully at some point he was there earlier on, but we've got Professor Henry Theriault, which hopefully Henry will be able to join us. No, as soon as we get to him, we will. But Henry has published and spoken on genocide denial, on prevention, on victim-perpetrator relations, reparations, and particularly mass violence against women and girls, and also served 2 terms as the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. So we have roughly 20 minutes for Meryem and Henry to speak as soon as we get them back. But Meryem, on origins and impunity.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here again. This is, I think, my 2nd or 3rd visit. And it's also always a wonderful and very humbling experience, actually, to see so many activists, survivors, and politicians in a room with their focus towards this issue. And I'm reminded that the word focus actually comes from the word, a Latin word that means gather around the fire and warm yourself in community. And I think gathering is really, really important. And through that gathering, to start conversations that will shape our lives. So I'm speaking both as the college chaplain at St Hilda's College. I'm a very unusual college chaplain. I'm the first Quaker to be appointed to that position, which has caused quite a bit of upset at the beginning of my college chaplaincy role. And before that, I was a prison chaplain and an academic. And I want to, kind of inspired by what Philippe was sharing with us, I want to tell you a story from a recent spiritual journey, and I promise it has something to do with Armenian genocide, but a recent journey, a ministry journey into Syria. So I lived for a really, really long time in Syria for obvious reasons. As a historian of the Armenian genocide, Syria has a lot of sources, and also as an oral historian, I got to interview a lot of descendants of people, family members of survivors. But this time around, because I had lived so long in the country and left when the war started in 2011, I hadn't been back for 14 years. And my first trip was directly to Aleppo, where I met a wonderful Armenian couple. The gentleman was an ex-parliamentarian, ex-PM member of parliament in the Syrian parliament, and he took me to a little church in Aleppo, and the church was built in the 1920s without any kind of help by the survivors, by children, women, and men. So survivors of the Armenian genocide, and I got to visit this church. The church had been closed during the war, and there was an old church garden there, and I said, "Were you here during the whole war?" And he said, "Yes." And afterwards, we went to the school that was founded under the name of Karin Jeppe. And Karin Jeppe was a wonderful, wonderful missionary who was in charge of a special group or special kind of commission under the League of Nations to find women and children who were basically survived the genocide but had been absorbed into Muslim households in Turkey and in Syria, what we call now Turkey and Syria. So Karin Jeppe, under her name, a school was created. We went and toured the school. Now, I don't know if you have ever been in a school when there are no children in the school. You know, you walk through the school and you have the voices of the children in there. You see the desks that are usually populated with children and teachers. You see blackboards on which education is being brought to those children. And we were in this school and nobody was there. We were the first visitors to the school. We sat down, I brought some Marks and Spencer's cookies, so we had the cookies, and it was a really interesting experience I was sitting where you're sitting, and my friends, my Armenian friends, were sitting here. And suddenly it felt kind of like there was too many questions that were I was no longer able to ask. What happened to the school? What happened to the students? What happened to you during the war? And the only thing I could really say with all these questions that were kind of standing between us, said, I'm sorry. And they said, you are our first visitor since the war broke out. So the first visitor from outside the country for 14 years. And it suddenly hit me as now with my other hat on as an historian who works on the aftermath of violence and genocide, what it actually means to sit together with people who have not had a visitor, who had just survived war. What can you actually say except of I'm sorry, because there's nothing else that you can say and ask. So that's my little story. In connection to genocide and crimes against humanity, I completely agree that even one life lost as a Quaker, as a pacifist, one life lost is one life lost too much. However, I'm also coming to you. I'm invited as a historian at the University of Oxford and as a teacher there with my graduate students and undergraduate students. We work, there's a lot of dissertations now on the Armenian genocide and in the aftermath of the war, which I'm really, really glad, but I'm also aware that the students have interest now in the study of, or in the histories of violence because of what is going on outside of our classrooms. And I think one of the things that I always tell my students is that we have to be really careful about the language and the shape that we are giving to narratives of violence, right? Sometimes I even ask the question in the classroom, how do we write non-violently about violence? How do we write about war and genocide without actually perpetuating that violence? So that is one of the questions that I'm asking in my classroom. And one of the questions now, kind of coming to Raphael Lemkin, is that, of course, Raphael Lemkin was very aware that language is too small, it's always too brittle, and in the case of genocide, it always comes too late, right? And we who work on genocide and work against for the prevention of war and genocide, we're very aware of that, and we carry a lot with that. We carry the insufficiency of language in a sense, and that is a difficult burden to carry. However, I also wanted to tell you a little bit, talking about language being too small, language is also very good in describing. And I wanted to point out some of the work that has been done on the side of the British state to document Armenian genocide. And I think we are all aware of the Blue Book, the famous Blue Book, which was commissioned by the British government in 1916. It was finished in 1917 by someone called Bryce and Toynbee, and the collections of these two men and also other collections that are related to the Armenian genocide are held at the Bodleian University, Bodleian libraries. And as a group that focuses on the Armenian genocide studies at the University of Oxford, we have made a user's guide, and I have brought a user's guide today for you, but also showing you some of the significance that the collection that we are holding at the Bodleian, what the connection to Raphael Lemkin is, because we know that he has drawn on some of those sources that are now held at the University of Oxford. And these are sources that are both talking about what is happening when genocide is unfolding. So 1916 was exactly when the Armenian genocide was in full swing, when we were entering the second phase of the Armenian genocide, but also what happens afterwards with the documentation, because we all know that the Blue Book kind of disappeared in the 1920s because Great Britain wanted to have a treaty with what was then called Republic of Turkey during the Treaty of Lausanne. They wanted to have a single bilateral treaty and had some pushback by the new Turkish government about the Blue Book. So when it first came out, it had about 100,000 copies, and then in the 1920s, the publication kind of was stopped. And we found out really about the Blue Book again in 2000 when an Armenian scholar and historian based in the UK republished via the Gumidas Institute, which is a publication house for Armenian genocide survivors. Anyway, I have brought you all of the papers and the description of those papers if you're interested, because I think it gives us a good view into how to document what happens after the documentation, and some of those the thoughts and conversations that not only people in government but also humanitarian workers have when they fight about whether a documentation should actually continue to exist and what it should be doing in the broader political landscape of the 1920s and 1930s. It would have been important to keep the Blue Book, I think, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, but it disappeared because of geopolitical reasons. And we have a wonderful collection at Oxford. We have wonderful students who work on those collections. So I hope that you do visit us, and I can tell you even more about these collections held at the University of Oxford. Thank you.
And so, Professor Theriault, I hope you could hear us. You can, great. Thank you so much for joining us from Massachusetts.
Thank you so much, and I'm so sorry I can't be there in person. I was passing through Heathrow maybe a week ago. Oh, are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, you are? Okay. And it just didn't work out with my schedule, unfortunately. I'd also like to add how honored I am to be, in the same program with Professor Kalayci, particularly on the same panel, but also with Professor Sands and others who are presenting. And I'm especially honored to be in an event emceed by Minister O'Hara, who is well known for his human rights work on the Rohingya and other issues, and especially right now at a crucial point, Sudan, which I'll return to in a moment. And I can't help but note that this is very consistent with the foundations of his party, and I'll admit a bias that Tom Nairn, as some of you may know, is a famous scholar, was a huge influence on me in my earlier career. I think we owe Minister O'Hara a great deal, and he really is the kind of leader in the future that Lemkin envisioned when he was pushing for the outlawing of genocide. He really understood that political will would be crucial going forward. So as I said, I'm very honored. I think, with the opening video and so forth, we have some of the basics on Lemkin's relationship to the Armenian genocide in particular. The Armenian genocide obviously affected him a great deal in his sort of college years, during his legal studies, and really, I will say, confirmed the immediacy of the issue of genocide in the 20th century for him. He had, as a younger person, he certainly studied historical examples going back to the Roman Empire and other cases of genocide in history. But it was the Armenian genocide that he lived through, that he saw unfolding. He saw, particularly with the Tellurian trial, that made him realize, I think, that this odious scourge, as we call it, was very much a problem that needed to be addressed in the contemporary world. And he committed to that in a deep way, and I'm not sure, I couldn't follow Professor Sands' presentations. Hopefully I'm not repeating things. But he really made an effort to develop the concept of something that he would later label genocide in the 1920s, and then actually pushed to get it outlawed in 1933, failed doing that, was actually ridiculed by Nazis and others for pushing this issue. And ultimately, the Holocaust happened. He lost roughly 50 people in his family. Very few survived, his brother, for instance. he felt that was a personal failing. The fact that he was not able to get this issue in front of the world in the 1930s in a way that might have had an effect in helping prevent the Holocaust. I think he was taking too much on. I think the Nazis were going to commit the Holocaust one way or another, whether they felt it was outlawed or not. And he also, attempted to get the term taken up at Nuremberg, used as a charge at Nuremberg. And this, of course, was not to happen as well. I think in understanding what he was doing, we have to sort of disconnect a couple things around genocide in order to understand how profound his contribution really is. He wasn't just the person who came up with the word. He's the person who really developed the concept behind the word. And even a decade and more before he had the word, he had this idea of something more than mass killing, a mass destruction of a group through all sorts of different means. And that contribution is really important. We should never forget that it was an empirical generalization. I'm going to refer to the famous Scottish philosopher David Hume, who said quite a bit about this issue. Lemkin wasn't claiming that there was some natural event that he later labeled genocide. He looked at history. He looked at the contemporary world in front of him. He saw a number of events that had similar characteristics, and he felt the urgency with naming those events under one term. So the term was meant to unify all these things that we were not seeing as linked. And he did that in great, in tremendously important ways. Oftentimes the Holocaust is seen as the model of the concept of genocide, both that Lemkin developed in the 1930s, which it couldn't be, 1940s, and then that the UN developed or took up and created as international law a bit later. But really for him, the Holocaust was not the model. The Holocaust, unfortunately, was the first great confirming case of the concept that he had already been developing. It's when the Holocaust happened that he saw, again, something that he had been thinking about, writing about, talking about for a decade, suddenly unleashed with a kind of, at a level that we might certainly call unprecedented. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind. We should also keep in mind that the legal issue and the conceptual issue are two different things. It's one thing, and we see this a lot with deniers, saying that the term genocide cannot be applied before Lemkin actually coined it in 1944 to earlier events. That's actually absurd. When you look at what Lemkin was trying to do, he was trying to give a label for something that had been occurring throughout human history and was very clear that his cases were not just the Holocaust, but all these cases in human history. That's very different from a legal issue, which is whether a law against genocide could be retroactively applied, which is I'll leave to the much more capable lawyers in the room to sort out. But I want to be clear that the concept genocide, Lemkin really thought he was giving voice to something we should have been noticing. The other thing that's really important about his work is that he was very concerned with impunity and the danger that was represented both by different parties seeing that genocide could be committed without punishment, without any consequences, and then realizing they could commit genocide themselves. We see this a lot of times with Hitler's relationship to the Armenian genocide and Kemal Atatürk and so forth, as really enabling him to feel, perhaps wrongly, but to feel very, very able to commit the Holocaust without any consequences. But also repeat perpetration by the same perpetrators. And I think, as I mentioned, Sudan and Minister O'Hara's important work there, we can't forget that the Sudan genocide happening now is actually the third. It's a renewal of the Darfur genocide, but it's also a continuation of the Nuba Mountain genocide of the 1990s. This is a long-going thing, and because no one has ever been brought to justice, there hasn't been transitional justice, we see this occurring again. Similarly, with what we saw, the ethnic cleansing / genocide of Armenians of Artsakh, which is renewed genocide from the past. I would just like to finish with what I think is something as a tribute to Lemkin. About 15 years ago, scholars in genocide studies started looking back at Lemkin, and they found a number of very untapped potentials in his work that they began exploring. For me, that is the way in which Lemkin conceived of genocide as not just a sort of physical killing or destruction, but as having cultural, social, political, religious, and for me especially ethical dimensions, destroying the ethics of the people you're targeting, destroying their social networks, destroying the basis of the spirituality. And I'm very excited that we're talking about Lemkin now, not just as a past figure, but as someone who I think we need to go back to again and again to see some new ideas that have yet to be really developed. So I'll leave you with that, and hopefully we'll have some conversations about that down the road. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Dr. Zoë Norridge is from King's College in London, who researches cultural responses to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. She has made 2 radio documentaries on Rwandan returnees and living with the memory of Rwanda, and is a member of the UK Holocaust Memorial Trust. Dr. Rebecca Jinks is a senior lecturer in modern history at Royal Holloway University in London. She's a historian of genocide and humanitarianism, and has published books on it, and is now completing a government-funded project into the Armenian and the Yazidi women who were taken captive during the genocide, both in 1915 and again in 2014. And Professor Eric Gordy of Political Cultural Sociology and the School of Slavonic Studies at the University College London. And Alphonsine Kabagabo, I pronounced that correctly, Alphonsine, survivor of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis and a former director of Women for Refugee Women. And we're absolutely delighted that you are here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Shall I stay sitting so we can move smoothly between us?
That would be perfect, yes.
Yeah, can you hear me, everybody? Great. So thank you. It is a huge honour to be here today. As we've heard, Lemkin spent his life fighting for the recognition of genocide for 2 reasons. One, to hold perpetrators of this crime to account. The other, to prevent further killings. Rwandan Mayor Jean-Paul Akayesu was the first person to be found guilty of genocide by an international tribunal in 1998. His conviction was made possible by Lemkin's work. So to a certain extent, the Genocide Convention has had some success in bringing perpetrators to account. But the other purpose of Lemkin's work, to prevent further killings, as we sadly all know, has met with much less success. In the days and weeks and months following the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana on April 6, 1994 in Rwanda, during those days and weeks afterwards, Rwandan exiles and others continually made statements to the UN and other authorities about the planned killings taking place in Rwanda being clearly genocide. They were saying that in April. Already in April, they were saying that in May, they were saying that in June, and still nothing was happening. For 3 whole months, the international community failed to take action and stood by as the majority of the Tutsi population were killed. I've spent the last 15 years working with Rwandan survivors and artists exploring ways to respond to this genocide. One recent project is particularly relevant to our discussions today. It is a book edited by survivor artist Jo Ingabire Moyes that I associate edited. And it's entitled 100 Days, 100 Stories, and Alphonsine has a story within that collection. It contains accounts of living through genocide and its aftermath by survivors, by rescuers, by perpetrators and their children, one for every day that the genocide was allowed to continue. In one story towards the end, survivor writer Yolande Mukagasana describes sharing her testimony for the first time in Belgium just a year after the genocide. Now, Yolonde's husband and her 3 children were all killed with machetes and buried in mass graves during the genocide. She survived very much alone, with a strong sense that she had to bear witness to her experiences. When she arrived at this commemoration just a year after losing her entire family, she realised that there were members of the old genocidal regime in the audience. People who had perpetrated those killings were in the audience alongside their Belgian supporters. And she recalls, "I was well prepared and had written out my testimony. But when I began speaking, I couldn't stop crying. Looking back, I don't think it was grief that made me cry. It was revolt. I was rebelling against what had happened to me. These people seemed to think that it was normal that there had been 1 million deaths in Rwanda, that our people had been eaten by dogs on the hills, and that the UN Blue Helmets had done nothing." And that line for me is incredibly important. These people seemed to think that it was normal that there had been 1 million deaths. That is what she is protesting against. I see in Mukagasana something that I also see in Lemkin, the loneliness and the devastation of the person who has been dehumanized and marked for eradication, who has lost everyone, and who goes on to devote their life to campaigning for change, even when that work comes at great personal cost. Rwandans, like Lemkin, fought hard for recognition that what happened to them was a genocide. Rwandans, like Lemkin, have also taken seriously the knowledge that genocide repeats. Lemkin paid attention to the genocide in Armenia, to the pogroms against Jews in Ukraine, to the many examples of genocide across history, and he understood the importance of naming this as genocide, something the UK government has yet to do in relation to Armenia. In Rwanda, violence against the Tutsi began in 1959. It continued in the 60s and 70s, and at that point it was impossible politically to commemorate that violence in public. So when violence came again in 1994, it was familiar. And naming that violence as genocide, alongside transitional justice measures, has formed the basis for peace. When Israelis experienced violence at the hands of Hamas on October the 7th, 2023, Rwandans responded with an outpouring of empathy, knowing what it is like to have lived through a genocide and to still be faced with existential fears about your own survival. Now, 2 years later, the UN Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, chaired by a former president of the International Criminal Tribunal on Rwanda, has referred to the Israeli state's violence against Palestinian civilians in Gaza as genocide. In June, I was at a ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral to mark 30 years since the genocide in Bosnia. Munira Subrisic, whose husband and sons were killed in Srebrenica, spoke passionately in Bosnian, calling all of us in the audience to take action to respond to the killing of Palestinians. In August, 2 months later, Remembering Srebrenica put out a statement saying, and I'm quoting, "We cannot mourn the victims of Srebrenica without recognizing the parallels of suffering in Palestine." They then urged the international community to hold Israel to account. Courageous survivors such as Lemkin, Mukagasana and Subrisic show us the way. Civilians are still dying daily from genocide around the world, including from the ongoing genocide in Sudan. It is not enough to wait until an international court deems this to be genocide after the fact. Lemkin was protesting the genocide of the Jewish people during the Holocaust. 125 years after his birth, his sense of urgency in naming and calling state actors to account is something I think we should all be aspiring to today. And I'm passing on to Alphonsine, who's lived that very much directly, that sense of urgency and the need to call out genocide while it is occurring. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. So my name is Alphonsine Kabagabo. I am a very, very lucky survivor of the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi. I grew up in Rwanda until 1994. When the genocide happened, I was 32, almost now 32 years after I lived in the UK. So what Zoe was referring to, when I lived in Rwanda, I was a Tutsi. I was a young woman, so I felt the discrimination of just being a Tutsi. But I was very lucky because my dad, luckily, went to school and understood the importance of going to school. So I went to school, I went to university, and I was a teacher. I had 13 siblings, so a family of 14 children. When the genocide started on the 7th of April, after the killing of the president, 12 of my siblings were already refugees. What Zoe was saying, because since 1959, the discrimination, the killings made in 1973 meant they were refugees in Burundi, in Congo, in Canada, but in Belgium. And that's what saved me and my family. And God, of course, I'm a believer. Because when the genocide started on the 7th, myself, my baby who was 6 months, my parents, we were all together in the house. That was next to a Catholic church. We believed strongly that we will go and hide in the Catholic church because when the president was killed, we knew without any doubt that we're going to be killed. It has started already in 1990. It has started. We lived in fear. We lived in hiding. But that day we knew we were going to die. The same day, the soldiers, the mission, they came to my parents' house to kill us. But luckily, my dad gave them money, gave them everything, and they let us run to the Catholic Church. And we thought, we're safe. My dad has lived through a lot of killings of the Tutsi. When we were in Rwanda was very Catholic, so we knew we'd be safe. However, we were not. They started coming to kill people in the church. Again, miracles. We survived. My mom was on the floor, bodies on top of her, survived. My dad, so I need to be short here. I can't tell you the whole story. What I wrote in this book is the miracle happened. One of my sisters who lived in Belgium married a Belgian guy who was a soldier who was sent to Rwanda in 1994 to rescue other Belgians. Only the international community, the Belgian government, they did not allow them to protect Rwandan. They were here to protect expatriate. But because he was married to my sister, he has that special permission to come and see if we are alive. He knew we were hiding in that Catholic church. We were no longer in the church because they have killed people. The priest has hid us in a small room. He found us there on the 13th of April. Took us 9 people. My parents, myself, my daughter, my sister, and her 2 children, and 2 other nieces and nephews. Imagine if he was around with all the Belgians, because there were a lot of them with guns and able to kill all the mission. They were not allowed. They were not allowed to take, actually they were allowed only to take my mom and my dad. But he said, no, I cannot leave you. So imagine, when we got in Belgium, to cut the story short, we went through Nairobi, took us to Belgium. I became a refugee in Rwanda. I was a teacher. I was teaching history. I used to teach about the First War and the Second War, talk about the Holocaust. Never imagined that it will happen to Rwanda and to us. When I was in Belgium, in the first few weeks when I recovered, I said, we need to talk about what is happening. So I joined a small group of Rwandan. We had a radio called Peace Radio. We started talking about this killing need to stop. But the genocide did not occur to me that it was a genocide until later. One of my friends came and said, we have to say it's a genocide. I have been researching, this is a genocide. So we start raising awareness about it. I will cut the story short, say after that, after 4 years in Belgium, when I became a refugee, I moved to UK to work for the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts because I was a girl guide all my life, which saved also my life. And I started talking about peace building with young people. A few years ago, I became the director for Women for Refugee Women, an organization in the UK that supports women who are refugees and asylum seekers, which was a chance for me to give back. But what I learned every day in my job is genocide was still happening. Most of the women we supported were coming from Sudan, from Syria. And I told myself, how can the international community continue to look at that? So I'm not an academic, I don't know much about it, but my fight for now is how can we stop this continue to happen? I got a chance to survive because a Belgian soldier who was around rescued me and my family. Why can't the international community do something about that? So I'm not going to go any on, but I'm such a lucky survivor, and my fight for me is to say, is one day what is happening in Sudan and Gaza, can that stop? Can we just make sure this international community do something about it? So that will be my calling, because we talked a lot about genocide, but what is the point if it continues to happen in front of our eyes? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alphonsine. Okay.
In the summer of 2019, Hadia was finally freed from a prison camp in Ain, northern Syria, and taken to a Yazidi safe house near Hasaka. Now aged 20, over the past 5 years, she had endured a litany of abuse at the hands of 4 Islamic State owners and had been hauled from her home in Sinjar through Mosul, Raqqa, Dazor, Kobani and Ain Issa before Hasaka. She was now going to be on her way to Hanka IDP camp in the Kurdistan region of Iraq to join her remaining family. And that is where I met her 2 years ago and listened to her story. Almost exactly 90 years earlier, Siranush was on her way to a new Armenian village, in fact set up by Karen Yeper, Suzan was telling us about, a few miles outside Raqqa. In 1915, aged 11, she had been deported from her home in Karagöl near Sivas. After 250 miles of walking, she was grabbed away from her mother and spent the next 14 years in the hands of 2 Turkish brothers. She eventually escaped to a rescue home, Karen Yeper's rescue home near Aleppo, married another escaped Armenian, and they moved to that new village, Tel Samen, which today, in fact, is a refugee camp. A century apart, but with overlapping paths and experiences, the stories of Hadia and Siranush and thousands like them illuminate what I call genocidal captivity, which was a key component of the Armenian and Yazidi genocides. Lemkin did speak about sexual violence as a method of genocide in the 1940s, and he relied quite heavily on the support of women's advocacy groups to get that law against genocide on the UN's agenda. However, references to rape and sexual violence were gradually deleted from the draft wording of the convention as it progressed through those highly political drafting committees. But Lemkin had been very clear from the start that genocide has a colonial dynamic. By surrounding and destroying people, their cities and villages, and erasing their culture, the perpetrator can assert control and rebuild in their own image. Yeah. Genocide has 2 phases, said Lemkin. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. During genocidal captivity, this national pattern is imposed not just on land and society, but on the bodies and identities of victims like Hadia and Siranush, who were converted, renamed and absorbed into the new Turkish nation and Islamic State society. In my remaining time, I want to emphasise 3 things. I've moved, yes. First, where it occurs, genocidal captivity is not a byproduct or a secondary method of genocide. It is, in fact, central to those genocides. It is crucial in attracting recruits and dispensing rewards and status to them. And the perpetrators, of course, benefit from the domestic labour and, quite bluntly, the cash value of captives. But I also think more symbolically, taking these women captive and absorbing them, asserting dominance over them, also signals to the wider perpetrator group that the old days are over. The Armenians and Yazidis, whom the Young Turk and Islamic State functionaries had actually feared in their own ways, were now humiliated, impotent and obedient. Physical destruction was not enough. Taking some victims captive and ensuring their submission assured the perpetrators that they had won. And the survivors, of course, give us a unique insight into these perpetrators. In fact, they even allow us a glimpse into their houses. And interestingly, although the captives are converted and renamed, they're forcibly married and they give birth, they are never considered proper full members of the perpetrator group. Instead, they are constantly reminded about their origins with disdain and with violence. Second, pre-existing social attitudes towards women affect captives' experiences. It affects their capacity to resist genocide and their return and recovery. And to be clear, I don't only mean the perpetrators' attitudes towards women. In the pre-genocide Armenian and Yazidi communities, there were very strongly patriarchal attitudes, which meant that women were often unused to standing up for themselves. They were taught to be deferential and obedient, and they had internalized the idea that once raped, they were broken, irreversibly tarnished, and would probably be ostracized if they returned to their original communities. And for those who did return, despite some big strides forwards that both communities made, these same patriarchal and patrilineal attitudes meant that women with children born of rape had to decide either to return without their children or to remain with them as captives. And this devastating decision faced both Hadia and Cyrinush. When Hadia left for Hanka, her child stayed in the Yazidi safe house and was given up for adoption. When Cyrinush left with her new Armenian husband for Tel Samen, her daughter Lucia was sent to an orphanage in Lebanon. And finally, how we write about genocidal captivity matters. In media articles, advocacy reports, and academic writing, the stories most often retold are those of younger women like Hadia and Cyrinush who suffered extreme sexual violence. In the exhibition I co-curated last year at the Vienna Holocaust Library, we deliberately included the stories of Armenian and Yazidi women who were not raped but were kept as servants, who were older, who had agreed to convert or were taken in by acquaintances and friends, who were adopted and sometimes treated as a daughter, who left behind their children fathered by perpetrators, all brought those children out of captivity with them. Those are also stories of captivity, but they are often marginalised. And what we find is that those with marginalised stories struggle to access the same social, financial, legal and familial support in the aftermath. One final point. Genocidal captivity also asks us to rethink when genocides end. Cyrinush spent 14 years captive, but tens of thousands of Armenians never left. And today, some 2,500 Yazidis are still captive. That is an ongoing genocide. Thank you.
Hello, I think that what I'm here for especially is to talk about some of the importance, some of the implications, and some of the lessons of the genocide in Srebrenica. So I'll begin by saying that Srebrenica is a landmark instance in the sense that it produced the second criminal conviction of a person for committing genocide by an international court in the world. The first was, of course, the genocide in Rwanda. In both of those cases, you had people convicted for genocide for violence that was committed at the level of a community, of a city. One of the things about the judicial finding in Srebrenica, and this is an instance that people point to, when they're trying to talk about the limitations of relying exclusively on criminal prosecution and legal institutions to address the legacies of violence, is that you have this anomalous situation in which the legal findings of the courts are in conflict with the findings of history and social science regarding the facts of the events, because what the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia found was that genocide was committed in Rwanda, but did not find that this genocide was committed as a part of a genocidal plan, or with a genocidal intent that characterized the war aims of the people who committed the genocide and the people who sponsored them. And so this case is often used to illustrate ways in which, depending on institutions to help to tell the story and set the record straight, is an activity that is constrained by the limitations of these institutions. So when we ask the question of whether the findings regarding genocide in Srebrenica have helped to prevent genocide, or to raise consciousness, we can see some of the barriers to trying to stop or to prevent genocide in the world today. I mean, one of those barriers is something that is apparent to us every day in trying to confront ongoing events, and that is that the interests of truth and justice are very often not in harmony with the interests of powerful states. And I can perhaps leave it like that without mentioning any names, because I'm not here to lobby and you all know what I'm talking about. although I might feel obligated to mention what seems to be the ongoing case of our colleague at Sheffield Hallam University, Professor Laura Murphy, who seems to have been prevented in investigating ongoing genocide by the activity of another state with the cooperation of the university that is her employer. And I mention this because a case like this, if what we hear as the facts are in fact the facts, are of concern to everybody in our profession. But aside from the interests of powerful states, the other big force that we fight is lack of interest. Because there are ongoing genocides about which we hear news and details and are aware of activity every day. And there are some that we do not hear of at all. Very often, like the ongoing genocide in Sudan, the only information that we hear is information about the difficulty of getting information. So if we want to talk about lessons that have been learned and actions that have been taken in response to the genocide in Srebrenica, let me say this. I would say the accomplishments that we have been able to find on the field of politics and law exist. We depend on these, but they are limited. And if we ask the question, have we got better at preventing and punishing genocide than we were in the 1990s? Well, no. But what has happened is that there is one thing that we've become very good at, and that is gathering information and making it known, and using this to document events for the purpose of knowledge and for the purpose of criminal prosecution. People with experience in recent genocides have been actively advising people doing research in ongoing genocides with the experience as to what international organizations and prosecutors and courts are interested in seeing as evidence that would be persuasive. And we've also become, I think, pretty good at developing the kind of resources that will promote understanding and memory in the future. We're seeing now the beginning of archives from criminal tribunals, other investigative instances, and so on, becoming sites of public memory, and also sites in which we try, this is limited, we would be well advised to try more, to cultivate the next generations of people researching this type of violence. But I'll finish by saying this, that the people who are gathering and diffusing information, because of the increasing importance they've taken on, even relative to political and legal institutions, have for this very reason become the targets of violence themselves. And this is another group of people, if we want to talk about genocide as targeting groups, that we may need to be concerned about. Thank you for your time and attention.
Our final panel is looking at living testimony and lessons learned, and it's an enormous privilege that we have Dr. Agnes Kaposi with us, a Holocaust survivor, Hungarian-born British engineer, whose remarkable memoir, Yellow Star, Red Star, about her extraordinary life living in Hungary before, during and after the Second World War, and her escape to the UK, is required reading for anyone who wants to understand what it is like. So we're delighted that she's here. Similarly, Alice Nderitu, who's a Kenyan mediator who served as United Nations Special Advisor on the prevention of genocide with Antonio Guterres up until last year. So we're absolutely delighted that you're here to join us. And please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? I'm here to tell you how I survived the Holocaust and how the lessons of my life connect to Lemkin's legacy. I was born in Hungary 93 years ago, 93 years plus a few days. My native country has a proud cultural tradition, but as the Hungarian poet Adi wrote, the nation's soul was poisoned by hatred of Jews, Roma, and others deemed undesirable. My family were secular professionals, socialists guided by ethics, not religion. They were first persecuted for politics, later for being Jews. My brilliant father was unemployed, so we lived in poverty with strong family ties and a love of learning. First lesson: those in power can deprive one of livelihood, freedom, and even life. When war came, Hungary aligned itself with Hitler and introduced Nuremberg laws. I was 11 when we were forced into deportation trains. Our train was bound for Auschwitz, but 12 miles short of its destination, it was diverted to Austria. Nobody knows why. That was one of the miracles of my survival. We became slave laborers. Food was for workers only, and work, therefore, meant food, and food meant life. Our extended family of 11 included 3 children and 3 elderly women, too young or too old to work. I lied that I was 14 and joined the workforce to earn a food ration. Helping to keep our grandmothers and little ones alive gave me the strength to endure the unbearable. Second lesson: taking responsibility for others gives you strength. The Soviet army came, the war ended, but our losses didn't. My parents' health was broken, we lost our home and possessions, half our family perished, including my beloved uncles, drafted into the army, but murdered by fellow Hungarians. Third lesson: life is precious, possessions are replaceable. The end of the war brought no freedom. Fascism was replaced by Stalinism, a new tyranny. Speaking a different language, but practicing the same cruelty. My autobiography mentioned here, Yellow Star, Red Star, relates my fourth lesson. Tyrannies are alike. In 1956, the Hungarian Revolution offered a chance to escape. I was 24, a graduate engineer. My husband and I came to Britain, finding kindness and consideration, but also discrimination, or being in subtler forms. As a woman engineer, I was an outsider, almost a freak. As a researcher and educational innovator in the fast-developing communications and computer industries, I struggled against social and professional inertia. And my monograph, Woman at Work, tells you it was not easy. Eventually, perseverance brought recognition. I was elected Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, the 3rd woman ever to receive that honor. Fifth lesson: persist. Don't yield to entrenched power. In my 70s, someone who learned about my background said that it was my duty to disseminate my experience. I rose to the challenge. I embarked on a new career in my 70s as genocide educator. I was expected to focus on my Holocaust experience, but instead I also spoke about communist tyranny and even about discrimination in Britain. I addressed hundreds of students and adult groups in several countries and was interviewed by journals, filmmakers, radio stations, TV channels. I thought of education as dialogue, not monologue. I studied my audiences, seeking common ground between my story and their concern. I found that even in our liberal democracy, those who were different were often disadvantaged. Sufferers of discrimination carried prejudices of their own, and some survivors of genocide were indifferent to the suffering of others. Meanwhile, populism was spreading, and daily news reported conflict worsening worldwide, in spite of decades of anti-genocide education. The world has not learned the lessons of the past. Sixth lesson: we must rethink genocide education. Two colleagues joined me, Professor Anja Ballis of Munich, a distinguished German Holocaust educator, descendant of senior Nazis, and Professor Ian Pyle of York, an eminent British computer scientist, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, devout Christian. As academics and educators, we aimed to devise a new approach to genocide education with sound theoretical foundations and proven practicability. We appealed to colleagues, friends, acquaintances on 5 continents and assembled 60 first-person accounts of personal trauma, discrimination, exclusion, or genocide. Responses varied so widely that we had to define for them a new concept: the process of causing physical or psychological harm, damage, or suffering to individuals or groups, either intentionally or through thoughtlessness or neglect. Following Lemkin's example, we gave it a new word. We called it harmage. Using the scientific method, we formulated a general theory of harmage, we catalogued motivations of harmage, and named them brands. I was once, in a circumstance, referred to it, to the yellow star we wore, as branding, and that's where the word brand came from. Based on the didactic triangle, we evolved a model of the spiral of lifelong learning and identity development. We devised educational programs for countering harmage based on question generation and Socratic debate. Our programs suited ages for secondary school to post-retirement. We pioneered courses at the University of Munich, at Bavarian schools, and for teachers and students of a London school. We measured the effectiveness of our courses through comprehensive analysis of participants' responses. Our book, Harmage and Hope, documents our work. It is with the German scientific publisher Springer right now and will appear in March 2026. I presented it yesterday at the Discrimination Through Education conference of the University of Münster, a conference organized by our friend Fatima Ulfat, professor of Islamic theology. Do you follow? There is a Nazi descendant professor, a British straight down the line professor, there is me, and an Islamic theologian of Afghan origin in Germany. We form a group, right? The book reflects the lessons of my life. Whatever their motivation, all harmage processes are alike, and sufferers of harmage needn't fight or compete. Life is not a zero-sum game. Authors and collaborators creating this book are living proof that difference is no reason for hate. It is a source of enrichment. Last lesson, intercultural collaboration is the antidote to the poison of harmage. For the sake of peace and social harmony, we recommend our approach to harmage prevention education. Thank you, Raphael Lemkin, and thank you for listening to me.
So thank you very much. I have been asked this afternoon to talk about connecting Raphael Lemkin's legacy to modern genocide prevention and early warning legacy. And last year, at a time like this, I was with the Polish ambassador to the UN, and we were at Mount Hebron Cemetery. We'd gone to lay flowers on the grave of Raphael Lemkin. The epitaph on his grave reads, "Father of the Genocide Convention." And we tweeted it, and then it became apparent that I was the first UN officer to ever do that. And so sometimes we forget about the politics that define international bodies like the UN, we forget that the United Nations is made up of member states who are themselves political and have political interests. And so I'll just paint a picture in terms of what then Raphael Lemkin's legacy means for somebody like me who served in the position of Undersecretary General for the Prevention of Genocide. And so when I joined the UN on November 26 in 2020, and on December 9th, we had the commemoration of the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which is the Raphael Lemkin Convention, Genocide Convention. So it happens every year. It's a huge event where you have the Secretary General, you have the President of the General Assembly, you have everybody in the room and all the member states or the ambassadors, big speeches, and then we wait until the next year. So on the same day, Armenia usually holds an event. And it's a very important event because it was Armenia that gave us this, the resolution that gave us this day. So the day was not commemorated until Armenia wrote this resolution. And every 2 years, Armenia writes a resolution, drafts a resolution in Geneva for the Human Rights Council in support of the office of the Undersecretary General for the Prevention of Genocide. And Armenia, again, every year, without fail, on December 23rd, a check would come to the office of $20,000 every single year from Armenia. And that check enabled us to remind the world about Raphael Lemkin and also about the December 9th. And I say this because with other member states of the UN, we had to go and plead for money. We had to do elaborate proposals. We had to do all kinds of things. But Armenia always was there for us, always has been there for that office. So on this day, when we had the commemoration on December 9th, then 2020, and then the following day, and remember I was now about 2 weeks old in the UN, so I attended the Armenian event and I gave a speech. And in the speech I spoke about Raphael Lemkin. The following day, I got a letter. In the UN, they're called Dimash. So I got my first letter from Turkey. And a very harsh letter asking me to explain what I was doing at that event. And I was so taken aback. Nobody had prepared me for anything like that. An hour after I received the letter from Turkey, I got another one from Azerbaijan. Also asking, demanding that I explain what I was doing in that event and that, all kinds of things. Very harsh letters. And then just as I was figuring out what to do about these letters, a day after, Turkey wrote to the Secretary General telling him, who is this you hired? What does she know about this office? Followed by another letter from Azerbaijan. And the whole week, letters about me were going back and forth. And so it struck me, sometimes we forget the politics of the UN. We go in, as I went, with all the naivety of thinking, this is where we are going to solve all. We are working on prevention of genocide. Everybody wants to work on prevention of genocide. And it really, really struck me. But it also struck me that Raphael Lemkin did not feature anywhere in the UN. I couldn't find his picture in the General Assembly. I couldn't find his picture in the UN Security Council. His picture was nowhere. There was nothing. It's as if he'd never existed. So then I began a campaign for the United Nations to understand who Raphael Lemkin was and what he did. And so part of our going to lay the flowers with the ambassador was part of this campaign. So now, just painting the picture of the legacy of Raphael Lemkin, I think we shouldn't forget that when Raphael Lemkin was drafting the convention, remember what extents he had to take to identify considerations that needed to give way to political calculations. Remember his arguments to the Cubans, to the small nation states, saying this convention will protect you because you're a small state, you don't have arms. exams, and he had to keep thinking how to do so many different approaches. He was a polyglot. He spoke so many languages, and so he designed the lobbying arguments for the convention depending on the country. So he would make specific reference to the history of the country. And so, and in that way, then we were able to get this convention. And his legacy, we see it, for example, in conventions that came after. We saw, and not forgetting that the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was the first human rights convention that the UN ever adopted on December 9th, 1948, followed on December 10th by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it really came fast. And it was unanimous. 55 member states, who are then 55, approved it. How that even happened, of course, had to do with a lot of these political considerations. And then we saw his legacy in the Convention Against Torture. You see the language in it. And we saw that he gave the name genocide, as was explained earlier. He gave the legal existence, the framework through this genocide convention. He also clearly defined what this convention was about, because it was speaking to both punishment and prevention. We don't have any other convention that speaks to both punishment and prevention. So then, to date, 153 nations have ratified the Genocide Convention. It's part of what I was really involved in. And I was very glad to get a ratification, my last one, from Zambia. And those of you who are studying the ratifications, because often we celebrate the 153 who've ratified, I think it's important to look at the reservations. What reservations have they ratified with reservations? What did they say? Because it means that a lot of those countries may have ratified, but they are able to exercise state sovereignty of crimes that are committed by either individuals from that state or by the state itself, by the government, by virtue of what they've made reservations to. And then and then Article 6 had actually imagined the existence of like an international penal tribunal, and that became the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute of 1998. That is where it came from. So in terms of legacy, he really had seen like way ahead. And then in terms of definition, it really spoke specifically to victim communities, the intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic, racial, national, religious group, spoke specifically to the experience of the Armenians, spoke specifically to the experiences of other groups of people, the Carthaginians. He spoke about the Carthaginians. He spoke about the Huguenots killed in France. He spoke about the Christians fed to the lions. He really had that imagination of that famous question that Professor Sands spoke about when he asked his professor, why is it a crime when you kill one person and there is a name for that crime, murder, but when you kill a group of people in the name of identity just because they are different, not that they've done anything, why is it then a crime? And why do we not have a name for that crime? So we saw how when he was teaching in Stockholm, how he was able to obtain orders that had been signed by the Wehrmacht commanders. And this was used in the Nuremberg tribunals to incriminate Henry Himmler especially, and Hermann Goering. And we saw also, in terms of his legacy, that his assumption was that this repeated invocation of court action. He is a lawyer, he is a prosecutor. He's thinking the more court action there is on this crime, the more precedents will be set. Unfortunately for the world, between 1948 to the 1990s, nobody was convicted for the crime of genocide. And that's not to say that this crime was not happening. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, they killed more than 2 million people. That was between 1975 and 1979. We saw the Isaacs killed in Somalia by Siad Barre. We saw in Bangladesh also the killings that took place there. So the reality of the legacy of the Genocide Convention is that it's on how long it takes. Years after genocide for convictions, and also the reality of how many people like he needed to convince to bring this on board. And Nuremberg is a good example. When you think about the work they did with the prosecutor Ben Ferencz, whom I was very privileged to meet before he passed on. And prosecutor Ben Ferencz used the word genocide in the indictments in Nuremberg, and then tried very hard to lobby the judges in the verdicts to use the word in the sentencing, the word genocide, and which they did not succeed in doing. So, I've spoken to punishment in terms of prevention. It's much briefer because the convention is very strong when it comes to punishment, but when it comes to prevention, Raphael Lemkin had imagined that the schools could be used, mass media, press, radio, and films. In essence, exactly what Hitler had used against the Jewish community. He saw it as being turned the other way around and being used to prevent genocide. But then he had to remove that particular component that was expanding on the cultural and educational aspects of the Genocide Convention. So that had to be removed so that it could be passed unanimously. He saw early warning very clearly, and of course, early warning is linked to prevention. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler was appointed as Chancellor, he saw the early warning in terms of what Adolf Hitler had been writing about. And then he writes to about 600 Christians killed in Iraq at around this time in the 1930s. So he could clearly see this early warning. And then, but ultimately, the document that was passed as the Genocide Convention had to bow to political considerations, and so it lacks robust, stipulated mechanisms for preventing genocide or for supporting when efforts to stop it fail. And so so Raphael Lemkin placed the work of the Genocide Convention under the UN Security Council because he also recognized that sometimes we need military action for stopping genocides. But the UN Security Council that I've worked so consistently with in the last 5 years does not have the capacity to prevent or stop a genocide now. Why? Because the UN Security Council is so divided. And Raphael Lemkin, for him, the UN was everything, as it is for many people around the world, that internationally that people would meet and decide that we need to stop this happening. But the UN Security Council is too divided now. And we know that Rwanda, I'm so glad that Linda Melvin is here because she was a witness. She was a journalist when the genocide against the Tutsi was happening, and when Rwanda was actually represented by an ambassador in the Security Council who was giving all this false information about what was going on. And Linda was documenting it, and then she ended up writing these books. So it continues to be the same. And I would say that the convention, when I think about it today, because we couldn't have expected Raphael Lemkin to do anything, it really was a roadmap for accountability and for prevention. Offices like the one I was serving in were created to speak to that gap that existed. So I know that in terms of a way forward, Dr. Kaposi has spoken about education a great deal. And education matters so much. If you read Raphael Lemkin, he speaks about, as an 11-year-old child, reading with his mother and asking his mother the question when she was reading to him about the Christians being fed to the lions. And he was asking his mother, but Mom, why? Why didn't they call the police? And the mother speaking to him and telling him, you have to study and find out why this happens, and him seeing the patterns of places where the police were not helping, and him coming to the conclusion that actually when the Christians were being fed to the lions, that even if the police had been called, they would not have responded. And really, that then must be one of the driving forces. We must speak about how many places in the world today are in that same condition, where you know that you are going to be killed. And I'm speaking practically about this, about Sudan. because I know people in Darfur. I used to tell my colleagues in the office, with tears in my eyes, I would tell them, do you believe I know this particular person? This is her cell phone number. She just called me. She told me they will be attacked tomorrow at this particular time, and I know it will happen. And I'm sitting in this office in New York, and what can I do about it? And we have to keep in mind that there are still people who know that they will be killed, but they do not know who to tell. And so that, in essence, when we think about the shortfalls in response by the international criminal justice system, by the international system, the United Nations and the international community, that we must then ask ourselves, what do we need to do? We tried so much. We tried to have amendments done to the Universal Periodic Review in the Human Rights Council so that every member state could report when they are reporting on specific atrocity crimes as part of what they are reporting on, so that then we have some early warning on what's going on, and that did not work. So I now work for Aegis Trust, who many of you would know. And in Aegis Trust, it's almost a complete circle for me because I've worked with communities for a long time, and then I went to the apex of the international community in New York, and now I'm back and realizing how important it is that all the preventive efforts that we put in, that Raphael Lemkin gave us an example for, are vested really in the experiences of survivors, in the experiences of ensuring that never again stops being not being this statement that brings on fatigue. And speaking to Sudan, a country for which I issued 10 statements, yes, this is my last, 10 statements, and I briefed the Human Rights Council, and I briefed the Security Council, which really is what you need to do to alert when you know you're very clear that a genocide is happening. I must speak to the reality of the fact that just, was it 2 weeks ago, with David, who is my colleague, who is here, and James, as Aegis, we were writing a statement because we had the first person convicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes committed in Darfur 20 years ago. So what's happening today, we have to wait for 20 years for a conviction. We have to live with the reality of how the international criminal justice system takes a very long time, and that we really have to go back to the ground again and think again, what do we need to do? And so the question I leave with you, if Raphael Lemkin was alive today, what would he have done that we wish to do, that we should do, and therefore we will do it. Thank you very much.
Two minutes. Just a few words about the APPG Armenia.
I'm the chair of the APPG for Armenia, and we're kind of hosting the event of the APPG for genocide. Well, I must say, Brendan, Kirsty, George, and Annette have done all the work rather than me, so it's been really fascinating to listen. I'd just like to absolutely thank all the speakers. They've been really, really thought-provoking, and obviously learning more about how the Armenian genocide exercise informed the work of Lemkin. It's really important for us. It's something as an APPG we've campaigned for Armenian genocide recognition under our last chair, Tim Lawton, who was very active, and currently entering the youth group too. And I think I had to nip out very sadly just for a little bit, so I missed some of the speakers because the situation in the South Caucasus is clearly very difficult at the moment. We have a briefing, for instance, on Georgia, which was particularly grim, I have to say, a few minutes ago. But obviously, in recent times, we've seen the expulsion of 120,000 residents of Nagorno-Karabakh, and that's something as an APPG we campaign on strongly. So we'll continue to raise these issues for Armenia, but to hear from you the broader context of the history of the Genocide Convention, it was really, really important too. And just to say, in Cardiff yesterday, the first Armenian genocide memorial in the UK through Cardiff, and yesterday we held an event at 3 o'clock next to that, which we do every year. So it's very much at the forefront of our minds. But thanks to all those who did the work, and thank you for excellent speakers. And I know a number of our members will be able to come in and be informed by you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has spoken. Thank you for giving up so much of your time. We have run over, but I think if we were ever going to run over for an event, this was the event to run over for. The speakers have been absolutely fascinating, and I think what Agnes said, you know, the world has not learned the lessons from the past, and never again, that phrase never again is all too easy to say, but it's said so often by people who have actually no intention of carrying through on never again. And Alice, you know, what you were talking about, what the power that you give us as parliamentarians to be able to shine that light where people do not want a light to be shone. And with your help, you know, the work that you're doing outside of here, then people who are committed in this place, you know, will continue to be that thorn in the side of the powerful who can, but who choose not to live up to the promises that they made to humanity. And so together, I think it's really, really important that we continue that work. And so on behalf of everybody here, thank you for giving up your time and for all of the work that you do. Thanks to the Inter-Parliamentary Union, thank you to Aegis, thank you to Kirsty and George, and a huge thank you to Annette, who has been the driving force behind this. So thank you so much. I'm so sorry that we don't have time for questions and contributions, but I'm sure you'll agree it's been incredibly worthwhile. Thank you so much.
Thank you.